Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, we've been talking a lot about the Labour Party in this, and we're joined now by the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Emily Thornberry.
Morning.
Good morning, Emily Thornberry. In a few weeks' time, you could be Foreign Secretary. Will you, at that point, tell Donald Trump he is not welcome here for a state visit?
No, because he's been invited, and I don't think it's right for us to disinvite him. I think it was a mistake to invite him quite as quickly as he was invited. Frankly, Obama had to wait for years. I think it would have been better to see him settle down.
Some people will say so much for your radical change in the ethical foreign policy. Jeremy Corbyn himself said he was not welcome in Britain.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it takes these things in stages. I think we have to welcome the American president to Britain. We have to work with him. The difference that I have is I would be prepared to stand up to him. I would be prepared to say, I'm sorry, Mr. President, but you're wrong about that. We are supposed to be good friends, and these values are not our values. You're doing the wrong thing. So
you have him over here, and then you give him a scolding. You know what he's like. He may well not want to come under those circumstances.
Well, there we are. I mean, I also hear that he doesn't want to share a carriage with Prince Charles because he doesn't agree with Prince Charles on climate change. I mean, it will be a bumpy ride if President Trump comes to Britain.
Anyway, he still comes here this summer if you're Foreign Secretary.
We can't disinvite him once he's invited. I think that would be a great mistake.
Why not?
Because I think that it would be to the detriment of our country.
Right. Let's move on to the ethical foreign policy directly. You've said that Labour, unlike the Conservatives, would not turn a blind eye to human rights abuses in, for instance, China. What does that actually mean?
I think that we should not be afraid to raise these issues, and we should not be afraid to raise these issues despite the fact that we may be going for a trade deal with a particular country, but we do have to be clear about the things that we disagree with the country with. And I am very worried. I am very worried that when I see Theresa May going to, the Gulf states, for example, and desperately after trade deals and so on, she doesn't raise the issue of Yemen. She doesn't raise the fact that Saudi Arabia has been bombing weddings and funerals and civilian targets and so on.
Is your ethical foreign policy sufficiently ethical that if you raise these issues and you get given a very dusty response or a hostile response, the Chinese hate this kind of thing being raised, and you actually stop trade deals happening, you'd go as far as to endanger trade deals, endanger the involvement of the Chinese, for instance, in our nuclear industry?
Don't take these too far. I'm not saying that we're going to boycott China, for heaven's sake, but there is a middle way through the sort of fawning, frankly, which I think that we have seen Theresa May indulging in relation to Donald Trump, and the way in which we would approach things.
Let me turn, if I might, to Trident, because this is another issue. You don't like the Trump administration, and yet we rely on that administration for very close cooperation to make our Trident submarines work in terms of targeting and so forth. Do you withdraw that cooperation? Will our nuclear deterrence still depend upon the Americans under Labour?
The most important part of our defence is NATO. And that is a partnership that we have with America and the rest of our NATO allies. And we are committed to that, and we should be. And we have been committed to NATO for a number of years, and that continues. And so we need to work collectively with NATO.
So from your point of view, NATO is very, very important and a crucial part of our international obligations?
Yes.
I ask you that because Jeremy Corbyn clearly disagrees with that. I'm going to ask you to look at something he said very recently. Here's Jeremy Corbyn talking directly about NATO, and the words are very important.
We, in the radical end, the left of the unions and the Labour Party, have got to be realistic that NATO is a major problem and a major difficulty, and we have to campaign against NATO's power, its influence and its global reach, because it is a danger to world peace and a danger to world security.
So there it is. Are you going to campaign against NATO's world power or not?
I think that's a quote from 6 years ago, and Jeremy has been on a journey, to coin a phrase, and there have been a number of discussions, and it has been made, it is quite clear that the predominance of opinion, and within the Labour Party, is that we are committed to NATO. And the reality, the reality is that we have been relying on our partnership in NATO and the way that we have been buying things, the way in which we have been committing things. If we were to pull out of NATO, our forces would be, for example, how would we get our forces? No, hang on. How would we get our forces off Salisbury Plain at the moment without the assistance of NATO? We don't have enough frigates to be able to move them onto the continent of Europe, if necessary, if the Russians were to come rolling over the hill.
Have you made these points to Jeremy Corbyn?
Yes, I have.
And so you've put him back in his box compared to what he was saying, because he repeated those kind of sentiments during his first leadership campaign.
You will see from the manifesto that our commitment to NATO is a clear one.
And you repudiate what Jeremy Corbyn was saying there in 2011?
I'm not fighting with anybody. I am telling you that the Labour Party's position is a clear one. And I am Shadow Foreign Secretary.
This is somebody who's going to be Prime Minister if you win the election, and he is saying that NATO is a major international problem and that the Labour Party should campaign against it.
It's not fair. If you heard what he said at Chatham House, he did not say this. He did not say this. He is clear that we have a commitment to NATO, and that is that.
So you can unsay these kind of things? I mean,
you can change your mind.
Very clear...
You can change your mind. You'll find that lots of politicians change their minds.
Let's move on to the United Nations, generally speaking.
Yes.
Will a Labour government, Britain, engage in military operations without the support of the UN, ever?
We don't think that it is right for there to be interventions in other countries without it being done on a multilateral basis. We do not think that it was right for Theresa May to give unconditional support to Donald Trump in bombing Syria. We don't think that was right. We don't think he should be encouraged to think that it's right for him to behave unilaterally. We think that that undermines the security of the world. And the best way for the international community to proceed is by way of agreement. And it makes it difficult.
Which means the UN Security Council.
It means the UN Security Council.
Because my question, therefore, is it right to give countries like China, whose human rights record you've attacked, and Russia a veto over any possibility of us using military action ever, which is really what you're saying?
I think it is very difficult. I mean, I think, for example, in Kosovo, for example, which is a historic example, the Russians were vetoing the use of military force in relation to Kosovo, but there was international agreement that there should be some action in Kosovo, with the exception of the Russians. And there was the development of the doctrine of responsibility to protect, and so under that doctrine, it was legal at that point for there to be an involvement in Kosovo.
Robin Cook led the charge of that. You've cited him a lot.
Yeah,
he led the charge on that, and he voted for that.
And he was responsible.
And
he was developing the responsibility to protect doctrine.
And Jeremy Corbyn voted and spoke against that involvement. Who was right, do you think, Robin Cook or Jeremy Corbyn?
I think that Robin was right.
Robin was right, and Jeremy Corbyn was wrong about that. And looking ahead to other possible areas of tension, do you think a future Labour government would send a task force again to the Falklands if there was a crisis there?
Yes.
They would. So under those circumstances, because again Jeremy Corbyn has said he wants to settle down and negotiate with the Argentine government about the future of the Falklands, and I wonder if you would be part of that negotiation.
I think that as a matter of last resort, if British citizens are being attacked, we defend them. But we don't want to get into a position whereby, unlike the Conservatives, who seem to be so gung-ho, who seem to be so kind of, we'll send in a task force, we'll bomb this, we'll do that. No, that you have to look at the alternatives first. You have to try, I mean, in the end, there is no settlement to international disputes without there being international agreement. And it's a question of how do you get there fastest. But if we're under attack, we defend ourselves.
Do you think there is an available compromise over the Falklands to be done?
Well, I think that so long as the people of the Falklands wish to remain British, they remain British, so that's not going to be compromised. I think that there needs to be, hang on, there needs to be, I think there needs to be a future in terms of talking to neighbours of the Falklands, and I think that it is to the economic advantage of both that they're able to work more closely than they are at the moment, but certainly not undermining the sovereignty of the Falkland Islands.
Because again, you see, this doesn't seem to be what Jeremy Corbyn thinks. It seems to me ridiculous that in the 21st century we'd be getting into some enormous conflict with Argentina about the islands just off it. Yes, of course, the islanders have an enormous say, but let's bring about some sensible dialogue, he says. So in a sense, he is saying, let's talk about the future of the islands.
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with
I'm being very unfair to you,
You're being extremely unfair.
I'm quoting Jeremy Corbyn.
No, you're not. No, it's fine, it's fine. what Jeremy just said, why do I disagree with that? I don't see why I should disagree with that. I mean, you say, this is what he says, and in effect, therefore, he's saying something. I don't agree with you. I think what I've said is entirely in line with what Jeremy's just said.
Let's ask you about the big policy announcement of the last couple of days from the Labour Party, the Robin Hood tax.
Yeah.
Now, Sadiq Khan, who's in charge of London, has called this madness and says if you proceed without international agreement on a tax like this, companies just leave the UK at a time when we're leaving the EU already, and it's a really, really dangerous policy.
Well, I don't think that's an exact quote from Sadiq.
Madness is exact.
But the truth is that at the moment we have a tax which applies when you buy stocks and shares, and at the moment some people who are called market makers, who are hedge funds and so on, if they buy these shares, they don't pay the tax. Don't really understand why that is. That seems to be a development. Wait a minute. And then the other thing is that we also think that we should extend a tax to different types of financial instruments, such as derivatives, because actually that's a betting on the stock market, and it will help to stabilise the stock market. Many other countries do it. Hillary Clinton wanted to do it if she was elected as president. No one's saying that she's trying to undermine Wall Street. The European Union are looking into developing a policy in relation to it.
Would you agree it should be done in coordination with other countries to avoid hedge fund managers simply moving to Paris or moving to Dublin or wherever they want to move to? I mean, you want to keep the businesses in
Well,
Britain.
I think that actually the House of Lords committee on this was very interesting, and they looked at any changes of behaviour, and they said that they didn't think that it would be as drastic as some of the doomsayers say that it will. Right. And it's, in the end, it is a question of just, I think, of just tidying this tax up. It doesn't seem to me to be right that you can bet on the stock market or bet on a company's debts and not have to pay tax, whereas if you want to invest in the company, you have to pay tax.
OK, one final question. What do you say to your colleagues like Ben Bradshaw, who are going around telling voters in their local constituencies, vote for me, that doesn't mean a Labour government?
I think that everyone wishes to have, there is a choice. We will either get a Conservative government or a Labour government. And that is the choice that the people have coming up in front of them. And there is an entirely different vision. Our vision for Britain is an entirely different one to the Tories one. And people, and people need to accept that.
So those Labour candidates who say, vote for me, that does not affect the future of the government, are being defeatist?
Well, I mean, I think that we have we have another 3 weeks to go. I think that everything is to play for, and I think that we have, you can see the way in which we on a day-to-day basis are attracting more support. I think that the things that we came out with in the manifesto are enormously popular. Actually, we're talking to the public. We're giving them answers to their day-to-day problems. And people need to look at what choice they have. Not Theresa May's hair, not whether or not Jeremy Corbyn should shave or anything like that. Is about which politicians can offer you what. What is the two different futures that Britain has? And the Labour one is a much more positive one and is much more in line with what people want. There is all to play for, and I don't want them to be, to be quite as defeatist as he is.
As to whether Jeremy Corbyn should shave, we can discuss that later on because you're going to come and join us again. But for now, Emily Thornberry, thank you very much indeed. And now, Sir Michael Fallon, the Defence Secretary, has been used by the Prime Minister as her faithful attack dog so far in the election campaign. He is not, I think it's fair to say, a massive fan of Jeremy Corbyn, but of course he has lots of questions to answer about the state of Britain's armed forces under the Conservatives. Welcome, Mr. Fallon. In 2015, the Conservatives made a solemn promise to the electorate about the size of the armed forces. Can you remind people what that promise was?
Yes, we said we would build the army up to 82,000 by the year 2020.
And what is the size of the armed forces now?
It's coming up. It's just over 79,000.
So you have not kept that promise?
We haven't got there yet. It's not 2020 yet. We said for the 5 years of the Parliament, we would build up the armed forces, including reserves. We would get reserves up to just over 30,000.
You said, well, the quote was that we were going to maintain the size of the regular armed services and not reduce the army to below 82,000. The current figure is 79,000 of a regular army. So you have broken that promise. Well,
we said we'd do this over the Parliament, and we're spending a lot of money on
But you have reduced the army. Well, you said you wouldn't, and you have.
Well, we're increasing the size of the army up to 2020. There are 3 more years to go until 2020. We have recruitment campaigns going on. We're increasing the size of the Royal Navy. We're increasing the size of the Royal Air Force. And we're determined, of course, to improve the offer we make to our servicemen and women to attract the best of each generation to join.
Because at the moment your recruitment is going badly, you're not getting enough people into the army. You were meant to get 9,500 in this year, it's 6,000, and you're going backwards, not forwards.
No, I don't accept that. We are getting more people to join up, both regulars and reservists.
You say you don't
and
accept that.
We have several years to go before we reach our target, but we are spending more on the armed forces. The defence budget goes up every year, and we're giving them the new equipment that they need.
Well, you said, I don't accept that. I don't accept those figures. Let me give you them again. The target was 9,580 people to join the army last year, and the figure you achieved was 6,900. And that is why the top brass are so worried about you and worried about the army under you.
First of all, we can't force people to join the army. We don't have conscription in this country. The army has to compete with other sectors of the economy. So that was a silly
promise, perhaps, in the first place?
No, it was a promise over the Parliament, over the 5 years. We're only 2 years into the old Parliament, and I can assure you we are spending a lot of money on recruiting, but also on giving the armed forces the equipment they need. You've seen our aircraft carriers being built up at Rosyth. There are new frigates on the way to cut steel on in July. We're buying new aircraft, and we're investing in the equipment they need.
Now, you've said that you're going to increase defence spending by 0.5% above inflation. Yes. How much does that cost?
That costs roughly over the 5 years of the new Parliament, added to the 2 years of the last Parliament. That gives the armed forces roughly £1 billion more than they would have had if we'd simply met the 2% target.
So where does the money come from?
The money comes from a growing economy. It's a commitment we made. It's a choice to spend more on the health service, to spend more on defence, and we've reduced spending, as you know, in other areas.
So this is an unfunded commitment?
No, it's
going a bit Diane Abbott.
No, it's absolutely funded. It's not a wild commitment. It's properly financed, and we can afford to do that.
From where? Because the money has to come from somewhere. If
it comes,
is it more borrowing, or is it more taxes, or what?
Well, borrowing is slowly going to be reduced, but it comes from a growing economy, is the real answer to your question. Because we're running the economy efficiently, because the economy is growing each year, more people in work, we have more revenue coming in, and we're able to make choices, not wild spending or borrowing promises like Labour, but to spend more on the NHS, to spend more on defence, the things that people really care about.
That's the extra billion. Now, according to the Defence Select Committee and the Times newspaper, there's a black hole in your equipment budget of between £7.5 and £10 billion. How are you going to fill that?
Look, we're planning the biggest equipment programme in generations. As I said, new aircraft carriers, new frigates, new maritime patrol aircraft, new planes to go on the frigates, new armoured vehicles.
Okay, but it's the National Audit Office, actually.
Let me answer it. You asked it, let me answer it. That is a 10-year programme, and part of the cost of that programme has to come from efficiency savings, getting rid, for example, of land and barracks and buildings that we don't need, being more efficient in the way that we work. Now, we have to deliver
£7.3 billion of getting rid of fields.
7.3 billion over the 10-year period, over the 5-year period, I'm sorry, of efficiency savings on top of the efficiency savings we've already made. Now, that means if you've got airfields you don't need, you shut them down and you release them for housing.
Airfields, Mr. Fallon.
Well, we have 60 airfields. We don't need 60 airfields. You have to look at what you don't need. You have to be more efficient as a large organisation and look at ways of working. And it's absolutely right that to invest in that programme, we have to reinvest the efficiency savings that we make. And the big change in the last few years, by the way, is that we keep all of those efficiency savings. The Treasury doesn't come and nab them back.
All right. Well, you haven't persuaded your top brass. You haven't persuaded senior military people who wrote a letter to the Prime Minister recently. Let me read you a little bit of it.
Sure.
It says that your statements about the defence budget have been disingenuous, quoting irrelevant financial statistics. And they go on to say, the government boasts of spending 2% of GDP on defence. That's widely criticised as an accounting deception. The armed forces are having to seek further, very damaging savings in manpower, support and training at a time when the likelihood of combat operations is increasing.
The 2% figure is not our figure, it's the NATO figure. It was
but it's the way you've met it that they're criticising.
No, on the contrary, it is the NATO figure. The Secretary-General of NATO, Stoltenberg, was in London this week seeing myself and the Prime Minister, and he confirmed publicly that according to the NATO definitions, we are meeting the 2%. In fact, we're meeting nearly 2.2%. It is other countries that are not spending up to the 2%. He has confirmed that our spending is defined according to the NATO guidelines.
But these are former chiefs of the defence staff.
And
These are guys covered in brass.
Have you ever met somebody covered in brass, a former defence chief, who doesn't want more spent on defence?
So they're just rattling the tap.
They are passionate about defence, and so am I. I'm proud that the defence budget is increasing this year. It was 35 billion last year. It's 36 billion this financial year. It'll go up to 40 billion over the next few years, and we will be investing in the biggest equipment programme the armed forces have seen in generations. Now, to do that, we also have to be more efficient about the way we work.
What patently this government has not properly invested in is defences against cyber attack. You did not give the NHS the proper support and the proper money to stop this cyber attack, with terrible results for patients up and down the country.
In our security review, just over a year and a few months ago, we identified cyber threats as one of the three principal threats, and we set aside £1.9 billion to protect us better against cyber, and a large chunk of that went to the NHS.
We're spending you didn't pay for the upgrade in 2015.
Hang on, we're spending around £50 million on the NHS cyber systems to improve their security. We have encouraged the NHS trusts to reduce their exposure to the weakest system, the Windows XP. Only 5%, less than 5% of the trusts actually use that system anymore, and there is money available to strengthen these systems.
But you did not pay for them to strengthen that system at the crucial moment in 2015, did you?
That was an old system. We didn't want them to use that. We wanted them to use modern systems that are better protecting. No, we warned them, and they were warned again in the spring.
So it's
they
were
warned again of the threat.
Not of the government, is that what you're saying?
Well, we all have to work at this. The NHS wasn't particularly targeted. The same attacks applied to Nissan on Friday and in other areas of the economy, and indeed around the world. But let me just assure you, we are spending money on strengthening the cyber defence of our hospital system.
Is it the case still that the nuclear submarines, the Trident submarines, are using Windows XP?
No, we never comment on the different systems, obviously for reasons of security, that our submarines use.
Well, they better not be.
But our Vanguard submarines, I can absolutely assure you, are safe and operate in isolation when they're out on patrol, and I have complete confidence in our nuclear deterrent.
So there is no possibility of a malware attack against the military, as we've seen against the NHS?
I can assure you the nuclear deterrent is fully protected.
Let's talk about you talk about the nuclear deterrent. You used a strange phrase a little while ago when you said that you, in certain circumstances, you thought we would use first strike in nuclear weapons. Can you explain what those circumstances
Yes, the key to the nuclear deterrent is to leave uncertainty in the mind of any potential adversary if he's looking at a country to attack as to exactly what kind of response he can expect. It's to leave ambiguity in the mind of your enemies, and that's why we never rule out whether we would apply first strike or not.
So you can imagine actually using nuclear weapons before anybody else has?
Well, we use them every day, Andrew, every night.
Not like I'm talking about.
Well, what I'm talking about, we use them as a deterrent.
Things.
Yes, but the job of the nuclear weapon is to deter. It's done that successfully for over 50 years since we've had our submarine fleet.
See, you've been very, very critical of Labour on the nuclear issue and defence generally.
And rightly. Look at that policy.
They might say that the problem with your side is they want to talk first and bomb later. You always want to bomb first and talk later. No. Can I ask you, is there a single war since the Second World War that you haven't been in favour of?
Well, we obviously, when we voted on the Iraq War, we were under the impression given by the then Labour government...
But you voted for it.
I voted for it, like a lot of MPs, because we were told there were weapons of mass destruction there. And it turned out, actually, there weren't.
Were you wrong, and do you regret voting for that war?
Well, I regret the prospectus on which it was embarked. It was right.
But you regret voting for it?
Well, hang on. Yeah, I regret voting for it on the basis there were weapons of mass destruction, because they clearly weren't. But we were dealing with a dictator who had invaded other countries, and we were part of an international coalition. And the problem with Labour's approach is they're now saying they would never commit. And you even heard Emily Thornberry now suggesting they might negotiate over the Falklands. I think that's shocking.
Well, let's turn to another war that you supported. You're very much in favour of use of force in Libya. And let's read you again the Foreign Select Committee report on what's happened in Libya after the war that you were so keen on. It resulted in political and economic collapse, inter-militia and inter-tribal warfare, humanitarian and migrant crises, widespread human rights violations and the spread of Gaddafi regime weapons across the region and the growth of ISIL in North Africa. In short, it was a total disaster, and you voted for it.
Well, the reason for it, if you remember, was to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in Benghazi, where an entire city was potentially going to be wiped out. That's why we had the intervention. Now, you're right. When you do intervene, we need to learn the lessons of each of these conflicts, that there needs to be a proper plan for stabilisation afterwards. I've been working with other defence ministers in the coalition for precisely that in Iraq, after Mosul is eventually liberated, that we stabilise these areas and bring in security after the war is over, to ensure that the Sunnis there, for example, have a proper stake in the running of their country.
One domestic question, if I may. You've launched a new housing policy, council housing policy this morning. There are two small gaps in that policy so far as we can see so far. How many houses and how much money?
Well, the money is coming from the 1.4 billion we earmarked for capital expenditure from the autumn statement last year. So the money is there.
It's not new money. It's you're taking it from something else.
Well, it's not new money, but the amount of money for each council will depend on the deals we strike with places like Manchester and Birmingham to get more social housing built in these areas of a high enough quality that tenants eventually will be able to buy. It's a very attractive policy that will give people a real alternative to waiting to get into a council house or a flat of their choice.
Well, you and Emily Thornberry are coming back in a little while for a love-in, but for now, thank you very much indeed.
I'm not sure about the love-in.
Sir Michael Fallon, the Defence Secretary, and the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Emily Thornberry, are back with me. Welcome to you both. Emily Thornberry, there's been a lot of attacks on your party's patriotism and so forth over the last few weeks, as you've seen. And another story in the papers today about Jeremy Corbyn and the IRA. What's your message to those people who are patriotic, working-class voters, and they look at this stuff and they say, I just don't like it?
Well, I think that there were negotiations going on behind the scenes, and there were people speaking openly, and this is something which has been known for 30 years, and it's being dragged up at this particular time because there's a general election on. And I think
not surprising.
And I think, well, yeah, but you know.
Prime Minister.
I know. I mean, I think the question...
risk.
No, I understand that. And I suppose if you judge people by who it is that you spend time with, the question has to be, do you remember where you were on the 27th of May, 2007?
I'm sure you're going to tell me.
Yes, I am. So you were in Syria and you were celebrating at a reception the re-election of President Assad with a 99% percentage of the vote. Now, I'm not going to judge you on you going to a reception with Assad, and I don't think that people should judge Jeremy by trying to talk to people who might be open to a settlement in Northern Ireland.
I think there's a little bit of a difference.
Is this true?
There was a parliamentary visit. I was on a parliamentary all-party visit to Syria back in 2007. MPs have gone every year to Syria during the better times in the relationship between Syria and Britain.
But you were at the party, weren't you?
I don't recall any party in Syria. I remember a fact-finding visit to Syria that happened every year with MPs going out there.
Did you meet Assad when you were there?
I did meet Assad, indeed.
Shake his hand?
Indeed, I met Assad.
And you celebrated his re-election?
10 years... I didn't celebrate his
Well, that was what the reception was for. It was for celebrating his re-election.
Nonsense. It was 10 years ago. We had a different relationship with Assad here. But there's a huge moral difference between talking to other foreign leaders, and I meet them all the time as Defence Secretary, and Jeremy Corbyn's quite open support for the IRA, which was actually engaged in Northern Ireland.
Open support for the IRA. You really can't just go around making this stuff up. There's an election on, and people need to make decisions on the basis of the truth. You've just said, for example, that I want to negotiate the future of the Falklands. That is bollocks. I did not.
Is what? Just say it again, come on.
It is untrue.
You implied, just 20 minutes ago, you implied sitting there that there should be some international kind of settlement.
You really just can't make this up as you go along. People need to make decisions in this general election based on facts and based on information, proper information. And it's not right for you to go slinging around dead cats the way that you do. You know, people need to concentrate and work out, because there's a serious choice to be made.
And you've told us your excuse is Jeremy Corbyn is on some kind of journey, but that is too great a risk for this country. Somebody who's against a nuclear deterrent,
in relation to NATO,
soft on terrorism.
In relation to NATO, there has been a change.
Wants a demilitarised
and we
zone.
are clear.
Can I ask you both about a word that is being used again and again, landslide? Tom Watson said that if things don't change, then the Conservatives are on course for a Thatcher-style landslide. Why do you think he said that?
Well, I suppose he may have been distracted by the polls, but the polls are not things that have been terribly reliable but until now, and we have another 3 weeks, and we are going to be out there. We're going to be putting out the message and the truth about what Labour is standing for and what a Labour government will be, and what the choice is.
Michael Fallon, are you heading for a landslide, do you think?
The vote has been cast yet. It's far, far too early for people to start predicting the result of this election. We are going for a stronger majority to get a successful exit from the European Union and to build a stronger, fairer Britain after that.
You've nearly said strong and stable. Thank you very much.
He's coming, he's getting there, he's getting there.
Thank you both very much. That's all we've got time for this Sunday.